Um, r- Real quick before we get back to the show,
Yeah.
Tom was responsible for one other very big part of your life, wasn't he?
Tom was very aware that I had no social life. I did have a boyfriend from Indianapolis, and those relationships tend not to make it. And so he had a dinner party, he and his wife Meredith, and invited a cartoonist that he'd met in China, Doonesbury cartoonist. He and Tom Brokaw had tossed a frisbee on the Great Wall of China together. And so Gary Trudeau was invited to a dinner, and it kind of took, and that's now 35 years ago. We've been married for 30 years. So
Tom eventually left to take nightly news, and they had to find you a co-anchor.
yes.
What was that process like?
This was, I made a little trouble. Bryant Gumbel came, and I'm looking as we speak at a picture of myself with Bryant and Chris Wallace and me in the middle, and I am laughing because it was so much fun. But when Bryant Gumbel came, he was about my age. I like to point out to Bryant that he is older than I am and always will be, but not much. And he came from sports. Excuse me. He had a background in television. Bryant had a background in television comparable to mine. I will have to, between just us, admit that he's more talented. But it seemed to me that passing me over and not making me a co-host at that point was a huge mistake. And it wasn't just that, I deserved it and it's my turn or whatever, but, by 1980, the women's movement was significant enough to, to diss me was to, disrespect, women everywhere. And so I made a case, a meeting was called where I made my argument about why I thought, they were making a terrible mistake in not making me officially. I mean, I was still on the air. I was going to be his partner, but Bryant was going to be the host of the program. Now, the fact that there had never been an African American in any capacity on the Today Show before Bryant was also, I was aware of that. So I made my case, I had my shot, made my argument, and I lost. And then Bryant and I lived happily ever after. And how many years did we work together? 8. It must have been about 8 years. 8 years. 5 with Tom Brokaw, and the next 8 with Bryant Gumbel. And I adore these guys.
What kinds of stories did you cover together? What are the ones that stick out for you?
Well, the Pope is, I don't think either one of us will ever, forget that. There's a wonderful shot where I'm holding a picture of my newborn twins, and I've learned the Italian word for twins is gemelli. I believe I also had learned a little bit of Polish for the occasion, but I don't know if I had the confidence to trot any of that out. But there's a picture of me with Bryant and Pope John Paul II, and I'm showing him my picture of my twin babies, and he's blessing them. Now, I'm Presbyterian, but Bryant had been Catholic and had been an altar boy, and to be in the presence of the Pope was just, for both of us, but especially for Bryant. And there's this lovely shot of Bryant. He's kind of rubbing my back as we're having this little moment, together. That has to be the apotheosis. Is that the right? That was the moment. I skip over, going back with Brokaw, covering the royal wedding. The significance of that was that I was pregnant. I lost that baby, had a miscarriage. But then I went back to cover another royal wedding, and I'm pregnant again with my surprise, my Tom, my third child, and I didn't feel so good at that point. So, but becoming, I was.
And you're on the air around the clock that day, weren't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I told the first time with Princess Diana's the wedding. I told Tom I was pregnant because I didn't feel good, but I lost that pregnancy. Now I'm back with Bryant Gumbel covering Prince Andrew's wedding to Fergie, and pregnant with Tommy. I'm getting ahead of myself. Never mind. Forget that.
Let me ask you to define the Jane Pauley period before you're a mom and after you're a mom. How would you contrast the two, and how do you think the show changed?
I don't think I became any different at all after I had children, other than maybe looking tired. But I had been on the air for about 7 years, I think, and I went from being this 25-year-old very young person to being a fixture in the morning in a program that had suddenly become the second place program. Good Morning America came on gangbusters and was the #1 morning program. We were the giant, and Good Morning America suddenly is #1. They weren't even a news program, and it was humiliating. That was before Tom left, when that happened. So I'd been on the air, and now the program is kind of gliding, and suddenly I'm pregnant with twins. It was unusual in television because before the 80s, a woman who was pregnant would not be on television, or you would not talk about the word pregnant. Wasn't spoken much on television. Florence Henderson had been a regular on the Today program when she was pregnant, and they would hide her behind desks and palm trees and umbrellas, and she'd sing songs, and you didn't talk about it. Then on Good Morning America, Joan London gets pregnant. She goes first. I double down with twins. And then she has another, and then I have Tommy, and then she has a third, and then, so during the 80s, Joan London and I are having these dueling pregnancies. But with twins, it's hard to disguise twins. I didn't talk about it. I was a very private person, protecting my future children, who I never introduced them to the audience at home, never showed pictures. I showed the picture to the Pope, but I didn't show pictures of my twins, to the audience. My husband and I were very determined that we would raise our children off camera. They were not accessories to my career. Steve Friedman, who was the executive producer of the show at that time and kind of a P.T. Barnum kind of character, he said at one point, we'd put Jane Pauley's kids on every day at 8:30 if she'd let us, but she won't. But the being pregnant did cause people to notice me. You're not pregnant with twins, and subtly. And Willard Scott, he made as many possible references to my, my condition as he could. Little twin T-shirts, little twin teddy bears, So it was pretty obvious that I was pregnant. And Bill Cosby was on the show one day, and Tom was interviewing him, but he makes some reference to the big purple ball. I was wearing a purple dress that day, and I was apparently quite rotund, and so the joke was that I was the big purple ball. So my pregnancy and Joan London's, the two of us together on morning television, 5 days a week, 2 hours a day, women getting pregnant, having babies, coming back to work, was we were the most famous working mothers in America. And yeah,
What's wrong? What's wrong?
Good.
We're on.
I don't think it diminishes me or my career to say that my contribution to journalism was being pregnant and having children on camera. I mean, I didn't invite them into the labor room, though there were women working in television who did, who, were pregnant and then, delivered, and then there's the camera, and, I didn't quite go that far. But when you consider that in the 70s, the anchor duos were an example for America of a man and a woman working side by side, talking about important things in apparent equality, was a metaphor for what was happening in America in the workplace, as women of my generation took for granted that we'd leave college and get jobs, and took for granted salaries that should be equal, but at that point certainly were not. But nonetheless, the role of the anchor team, a case had been made, as a matter of fact, that Geraldine Ferraro's presence on the presidential ticket with Walter Mondale was a direct outcome of anchor teams. The man-woman, on the ticket was an idea that America had been ready for and made ready for by the presence of anchor teams on television. Then when the morning television baby boom gets started in the 80s, Joan London and I, just by biology and by our ubiquity on morning television, probably helped create the case for working while pregnant, working while having children. I mean, we weren't the first working mothers, but when Barbara Walters left the Today Show to go adopt a baby daughter, she not only didn't tell the audience, she didn't tell her co-workers where she was going that day. Women didn't put pictures of their children, in the office. My generation comes along, and I've got a boss who's saying, not only could I put pictures of my children on my desk, but if she wants to bring them on the air and show, I did one show where I brought my daughter Ricky, who was then about 2 years old. For some reason, Tom?
It's Lisa.
Oh, okay. You've got to be real.
Back on.
So one morning I did bring my daughter to work, only not to show her on camera. I don't remember why she came. It was crazy. She's 2.5 or 3, and she's over to the side, and mommy's got to do an interview. I was doing a two-way interview, so whoever I was talking to was in Chicago or somewhere. And in the course of the interview, I become aware of activity at my feet, and I look under, and there's my daughter, and she's of an age where if I told her to be quiet, she wouldn't. Now I'm trying to do an interview, where am I in the interview, and do this, oh my, what is she doing? And but the fact that I had children endeared Joan, to the audience. It gave me more credibility, not less. Joan and I took very different tacks. She would do mother's moments. She would appear in ladies' magazines with advice, for mothers. And I went the opposite way. I didn't deny that I had children, but they did not appear with me. I would talk about them in a generic way because I thought that to deny that they existed would create too much interest in them. So it was sort of a paparazzi jujitsu thing that, the more I talked about them, the more people thought they knew about them, the less interested they would be. We did a show once on a cruise liner, an ocean liner, and I did not realize, nor did Bryant Gumbel, that the Today Show had a contest so that if you were one of the lucky winners, you got to go sailing for a week on a cruise liner with Bryant and Jane. And I had my family with me. Now I find out that there are hundreds of people aboard the ship who are, viewers, which is fine. I mean, I love them. But my family is there. The twins are now about 3 years old. And at one point, I had some cover because one of our producers had young twins. People never do the math. The fact that I had twins 3 years before. There are these twin babies on the board. That's Jane's. I did nothing to discourage people if they wanted to think their babies were mine. They weren't. My kids. At one point, someone points a snap and shoot in the direction of my son Ross, who's 3 years old, and he holds up his little hand and he says, "No pictures." Which, by the way, is why you keep your kids off camera. They become so self-conscious about what this celebrity thing is that at 3 years old, I'm thinking, that's why, you try to have as normal a family life as you can. But even though I never talked about my children, showed them or anything, it seems to have underscored my authenticity as a real mother. And if I looked bad someday, she must have been up with the kids. Kids must have kept her, which sometimes they did. But to this day, women my age, give or take, 10 years, we raised our families together. And, they'll quote me to myself. I was a having it all debunker. I used to say, you can have it all, but not all at the same time, or you can have it all, a social life, a family life, a job, 2 out of 3, but not all 3. I used to say having it all, stress, burnout, and guilt, because I was held up sometimes as poster child for working mothers, which didn't seem fair to me, considering that I had high quality full-time childcare at home. So I never set myself up as mother of the year. But even at that, people were acutely aware that I had children. Tom Brokaw had 3 daughters. Bryant Gumbel has 2 children. There never was an issue about or interest in fatherhood. Or they could talk about their children. It just was different.
Right.
Mothers, working mothers. It was a significant decade, the 80s, and Joan London and I played an important part in it.
The show reestablishes itself as number 1.
Oh yeah.
Partly perhaps because of this new.
I think some people said Jane came back after she had her babies and she had such confidence. I don't know. I was a woman in her 30s.
Did your on-air relationship with Bryant change?
You'd have to ask him, because I thought our relationship was always about the same. Mm-hmm. And I think Bryant went through periods where he either admired me or was annoyed by me, and then we had, and have to this day, tremendous affection for each other. We were like brother and sister. The sibling rivalry aspect of brother and sister. My twins, for instance. Ross will, my daughter, who we call Ricky. Ricky never wants to best her brother, but she doesn't want him to outdo her. But she doesn't want to do better. Ross really wants to outdo his sister. That would be fine. That was Bryant Gumbel and me. We were close as siblings. We were brothers and sisters, and he really, really did want to outdo me. But there's a picture on the wall of my office that was the day probably our best day after notwithstanding the meeting with the Pope. But we are in Rome. Can't remember the place.
Looks like Venice, no?
It is, no, it's Rome. That's Rome. And, hey Gary?
Yeah,
You remember when you were the security guard in Rome? Where were we?
we were on the steps.
The
Spanish
The
steps.
Spanish Steps, thank you. Gary self-appointed himself security because my husband noticed that the security that we had employed, and there apparently was some reason to have some security, that they were all watching the show. So my husband, who was there, put on his sunglasses, and he was doing kind of a thing like he was security guard. Anyway, that's never mind. But that day, we had beat Good Morning America the week before. I mean, when you travel, you always get a bump in the ratings. But we were number one the week before we went to Rome. And we knew when we were standing there having that wonderful picture taken that we hadn't beaten Good Morning America, but that we were going to. And that year it's more exciting to be the horse that's coming up fast that you know is going to win the race than be in first place. And that particular year, the inevitability of our retaking number one was pretty thrilling. And we did.
Let's talk about another year. 1989.
Oh, yeah. In 1989, the ratings, as I understand it, and I was never particularly aware of the ratings. I mean, these days they're reported, weekly in the newspaper. It wasn't that way so much then. I mean, now it's like you have a Richter scale so that everybody knows at any given second, how you're doing in the ratings. But evidently at that point, around 88, 89, the ratings were beginning to soften among women. Good Morning America was making another run, and so that it was time. Whenever the ratings, you got to change something. You change the set, you change the producer. The last thing you change is the talent, but sooner or later, you're going to start changing the talent. We had been in Paris for the French bicentennial. It was a last-minute thing. There'd been a great deal of travel. When in trouble, travel. Lots of trips on the road.
Which wasn't your favorite
Which
thing.
was hard for me because I had small children. Mm-hmm. In what particular order, I'll get them out of order, but we went to China. There was the 3 weeks, the Olympics, 2 presidential nominating conventions, a train trip, and it was all because the ratings were, it was getting very competitive. So that was kind of hard on me, being with such 3 small children at home. But I did it. I went to all these events. And then at the last minute, they throw in a 3-day trip to Paris for the French bicentennial. Didn't mind that so much because my husband is going to go with me. So we have this wonderful trip. Gary and I are going to spend the weekend in Paris with the Today Show. It was very exciting. Though when we arrived at the airport, and they jetted us over on the Concorde, which is a very glamorous way to travel, but there was something up. People knew things. The staff was, we were all meeting to get on the plane. People knew things that I didn't know. So my antennae were kind of, aware. As we were leaving, after, I think we did a Friday show and we did a Monday show. And then we get back on the plane and fly home. We had a brunch with the staff, and Tim Russert, old friend Tim Russert, stops me on the way out of this restaurant where we were having like a cast party sort of thing. And I'm going on my way to the airport, and he reaches into his coat pocket and he pulls out a wire story. And he's got this long, mournful look on his face. And it's the news that there's been a change in the management at NBC, and the head of sports is going to take over news as well. And Tim knows that I don't know this. And he thinks he's mad at NBC on my behalf because a number's being done on me, and he doesn't want me to fly home and not know it. So he gives me the news. So I fly home and I realize that's what was going on. I'm not in the loop because I'm pretty soon out of the picture. Long story short, and then Deborah Norville comes, and she's doing the newscast, and she is a dynamo, and she is smart. She's one of those people you'd call whip smart. She's really smart and absolutely drop dead gorgeous. And Jack Welch, by all accounts, is thoroughly taken with Deborah, and she's been given an unprecedented role for the newsreader to participate in interviews on the show. And one morning I arrive, and she's sitting on the couch. The decision has been made that the opening shot will feature Bryant, Jane, and Deborah. I had noticed subtle things. They had done a new cast picture because John Palmer had been replaced by Deborah Norville. He'd been, for many years, our newsreader. So they have to take new cast pictures. And the new head of the organization comes down, and he's participating in this, and arranges a shot so that I'm kind of off to the side, and the picture has Deborah and Bryant together, and the rest of us are sort of around. I'm not an idiot. So, and I've got small children at home, and there's a point where a demanding job is worth it, and there are sacrifices one makes with small children, and then at some point they cross, and it's too much. So the rewards are going this way and the demands are going that way. So I go to NBC and I say, and by this time the press is way on it. The press is all over.
And this management change you refer to, this is Dick Ebersol.
Dick Ebersol. Created Saturday Night Live, Olympics. I mean, he's still a broadcast genius. So he wants to shake things up. But the press is kind of a little put off by how out there, Miss Norville is being pushed at the apparent expense of me. Somebody writes a story, an All About Eve story. What's the guy's? The Washington Post.
Shales?
Yeah. Probably the most important television writer of the day was Tom Shales in the Washington Post.
Hang on. Sort of apropos that we get a siren at this moment.
So Tom Shales of the Washington Post is, at that time, probably the most important to everybody in the business reads him. And he writes an All About Eve article about the older woman, me. I'm now, at that point I was 38, and Deborah was 9 or 10 years younger than I was. So that she personally was, pushing me out of the picture. Deborah was just very good at what she did. It was hard not to notice someone that good and that beautiful. And the network clearly was, preparing her for important things. She had probably offers at other networks, so if they didn't give her you know, more attention, would she leave? And, you know, so that didn't want that to happen. It's standard in the business. It's standard. I had been there 13 years. So I go to them and I say, you know, I see what's happening to Deborah, and I've got my news clippings. It's happening already. They're telling a story on her. I'm the heroine of this story. They're going to ruin her for you, not to mention for her. Why don't we just settle my contract? Recently, there was Keith Olbermann left MSNBC, and it was the first time I had ever seen the word settle a contract since 1989. And so my offer is, because I had a couple years to go in a contract, I said, let's just let me go. Let's have a big farewell party. I've been here 13 years. You know, I'll celebrate. You know, that's long enough.
Did you really feel that way, Jane?
Yes, I totally felt that way. If I hadn't felt that way, I couldn't have been as persuasive as I was.
Your heart wasn't heavy, though? You didn't think, I'll do this show for another 10 years?
No.
You were ready.
In 1989, my children were 3 and 5. 2 5-year-olds and a 3-year-old. Mm-hmm. And the prospect of going to work at a job where I wasn't really wanted was going to eat me up. And there was somewhere I was wanted and needed. It didn't mean that I wanted to go home and be a full-time mother necessarily, but it did mean that it was compromising. You know, when your boss isn't in love with the work you do, and you're knocking yourself out, and you're traveling, and but you feel like you're sacrificing time with your children, it does start to eat at you. I needed not to be there, but I didn't need to make a big deal of it. I was happy to go quietly, and so I raised the idea of settling a contract. I'd never heard the word before, and we talked quietly. NBC made some PR mistakes at that time, and I made none. And so the upshot of what had been week after week of publicity, I mean, every morning USA Today, it was either my picture or Deborah's picture in the little corner box, and I was always, the saint, and she was, the All About Eve thing, and yet NBC wasn't going to let me go. And we would have these weekly meetings, and there were never raised voices, there were never tears. We would just agree to talk again. And one day I arrived at the weekly meeting, and it probably was our 6th weekly. This was going on forever and only building. It was the first media frenzy I had ever experienced. And the Berlin Wall was falling. Communism was failing, and there was this parallel story, of this morning television drama was getting all that attention. In 1989, the Cold War was ending, and still this story was there's so much attention. So I go to work. I had an epiphany that they were never going to let me go, and it wasn't about me. It was about the contract. That if my contract was settleable, everyone else's was too. So you couldn't just let Jane out of a contract without threatening, the viability of everybody else's. And then someone asked me, they said, "You seem to only have Plan A." And yeah, plan, that where I leave, we have a farewell party, and I leave. But you're not prepared for Plan B. And I had kind of the dark night where I realized NBC was not going to let me go, and I'd better figure out a way out of this. And I had an idea that one morning as I waited to be picked up about about people in moments of transition. I definitely was at a moment of transition. And that we would call this show Changes. And I kind of outlined some of the stories so that I went to the meeting that day, and I had this elaborate set of notes. So I sit down and I say, I've got an idea of something I think we can do together. And the relief in the room was palpable. So the story was, I leave the Today Show in order to I go off and do something else. And that's what happened. So I didn't get to leave the Today Show, but the Special Changes was like the highest rated special for, and I briefly had a Q rating higher than Barbara Walters. That didn't last long. Changes segued into a primetime show called Real Life with Jane Pauley that segued into a program called Dateline. And we lived, me and NBC lived happily, ever after. In fact, the guy I was probably arm wrestling with, Michael Gartner, was the president of NBC News. And he was the one that in these meetings that I was kind of face to face with. Dateline had a little trouble with General Motors. That's another story. And he was the one that ended up taking the fall, which was a shame because he didn't deserve it. He was an old-time journalist, newspaperman, and when I learned that he was going to have to leave NBC, that was the first phone call he got that morning. So we really did it was this spasm of difficulty that ended with tremendous affection.
Real briefly about Real Life for a moment. How many failed news magazines had NBC had up to that point? A bunch, right?
16? 15, 16, or 17, something. One after another. It was axiomatic that every network could do two things well and one thing they couldn't. CBS couldn't do a morning show. ABC couldn't do the evening news. And NBC couldn't do a news magazine. Even though before 60 Minutes there was something called First Tuesday. And I guess it was like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. You liked one better than the other. I loved First Tuesday. But NBC tried one after another news magazine attempt, and they all failed. And Dateline took big time.
Almost.
Well, it started.
It had a hiccup.
The problem was they put the show on the air real fast, and where Don Hewitt at 60 Minutes, he could book next Sunday's show. He'd have, a wall of, I could use this story, or it's ready to go, I could use that story. It would go well with, this is the time I can, he's picking and choosing from flawlessly produced, ready-to-go stories. And Dateline was living hand to mouth. We put on the air that week, a story that might have been finished 5 minutes before the viewer saw the tape roll. And then there was also, I remember they talked, a desirable show was strong. Everything had to be strong. My partner, Stone Phillips, came from 2020. And I'm also in love with Stone Phillips, by Tom and Bryant and Stone. I love them all. And Stone, unfortunately, was younger than I am, but far more experienced in news magazine. And I learned a lot about news magazine stories by watching, how he wrote them and constructed them. But this word strong, all of our stories had to be strong, and oftentimes strong meant that there was a gun in it. And I didn't always like the stories we did that first year. It wasn't always a show I would have watched. It wasn't to my personal taste. It was good, and they were professional, but it wasn't to my personal taste. It was It was too much drama, too much, shock and surprise. And
I mean, truth be told, this was not the news magazine you left the Today Show to do.
No, it wasn't. It really wasn't. And I was able to do the stories that I wanted to do. But when we did a particular story about, it was an investigative piece about General Motors, a truck with side saddle gas tanks that had been associated with fires in crash situations. It was an impressive piece. And I looked at that and I thought, boy, I didn't know we had it in us. It was really good. It was strong in a good way. It was investigative journalism as good as you'd see in 2020 or 60 Minutes. Except it had a problem. I was home with the flu. I get a call, Jane, turn your TV on. I turn the TV on, and there's the head of General Motors, CNN, and beside him, under a tarp that he's about to pull out, is a truck that has been found at a junkyard in Indiana, where I'm from, with the igniters still attached. Had our team told the viewer what would happen to these side saddle tanks in a crash if there was a spark, we're going to find out. We're going to attach these igniters, and we're going to deliberately make a spark to see what would happen in a crash. There's often, what would happen? That was the only mistake. They created a big crash, big fire. They got the picture. They didn't share that element with the viewer. To be honest, I gave a speech about this a couple of years later. That kind of technique was well used. And there were examples from 60 Minutes, Emmy Award-winning stories from 60 Minutes or 2020, where the same techniques were used, where, what would happen, only the viewer wasn't told that in order to create the flip over, the rim of the tire was shaved down, or something was done with the brake in order to simulate what could happen if.
And it was a third-party test group, right?
And it
that
was,
Dateline had hired.
Yes, the only mistake, and it was a huge one, was transparency. The journalism was fine, but for the transparency. But the story was, we rigged the truck. I remember that day that flip, and I knew what was coming, and the next thing I would see would be, myself on camera introducing the story. Long story short, and it was a short story because it was the first. Normally, when a General Motors would sue a news organization, this is going to be a suit that's going to be in litigation for years. General Motors said, we give you until Tuesday to retract and apologize, or a lawsuit's going to happen. So, in other words, we're going to litigate this in real time and on the media. There was an immediate hue and cry at work. Some people were saying, let's run it again, push their faces into it. And I called Michael Gardner, and I said, I don't know what you're thinking, but we got to be straight. It would have been good journalism, but for the transparency, we were wrong. We've got to say so. And he says, that's exactly what we're gonna do. But they were negotiating, with GM, and one night, taping Dateline, Stone and I know that negotiations are ongoing. And during the broadcast, we're live. During the broadcast, we may be asked to read a settlement if one is reached. We're not party to this. And by the way, neither Stone nor I did the story. Our role as anchors, neither one of us covered the story. And I remember on the air, the doors of the studio open, and someone walks in with 2 copies of this settlement, and they hand it to the two of us to read. and arbitrarily, one of the said, I'll read it here, you read it from there on. So Stone and I barely had time to scan what now is in the teleprompter, and it is an apology. And people thought, how unfair that Stone and Jane had to make that apology. They weren't involved. And I can speak for Stone. It was almost one of the highlights of my career, in that I, along with Stone, was able to say, these are what the standards of journalism are. And we take them seriously. And, when they're violated, you need to know. If you can't trust, the people who bring you the news, then why are we here? So it was unfortunate that it happened, but it was an honor to be the people who got to restore NBC's honor. I think Stone felt exactly the same way. But it went for, I never knew when I was I'd be riding to work in a cab, and I'd look down the street, and at Times Square, the crawl, and I'd see the word rigged. And I go, oh my God. I'd be reading Mademoiselle magazine on an airplane. And in the middle of an article would be Dateline. The shots were, you just never knew where you were going to be. But we got over it, and the show not only didn't die, it became the most successful news magazine in history.
Did you think it would die? Did you think that was it?
I did. I did. And Neil Shapiro, the executive producer, was replaced. A couple people, ironically, the people involved in the story had come from 60 Minutes in 2020, but they were good people. There were investigations, and oh my gosh, so they had to go, and Neil Shapiro came, also from 2020, and took over, and it was the audacity of instead of, how they break the sound barrier, you push the lever forward, at the moment where, you're going to crash and burn if you pull up, which is the instinct. When you give it more gas and go forward, that's when you break the sound barrier. Neil Shapiro did that. He was so audacious, he said, and he arrives and he pushes Dateline forward. We're on the air twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week. I mean, we're on more than, the Tonight Show. It was a phenomenal comeback, and I Neil Shapiro, saved.
How much time do I have?
You have 13 minutes.
Okay. Your years on Dateline, what were your most memorable stories? What sticks out as the story that would go on your reel if you had to do one today?
This is a complicated story, and I'll answer the story by anticipating a question that you haven't gotten to. But I got sick, and when I was 48, I had a recurrence of a childhood malady, hives. And the hives were treated, nobody knew what caused them. They were the swelling kind of hives. It wasn't the, itchy strawberries, allergy. It was idiopathic, means no known cause. And they turned up when I was 48, and with a career on camera, your eye swelling shut or a lip is swelling up. It was a real nuisance. Never got in the way, oddly enough, of television, but it came close a lot. Had them for a year, and on the anniversary almost of their reappearance, they went crazy. And I had 2 occasions where I was at the emergency room with my throat swelling up, which will kill you. And the treatment was no messing around. They gave me steroids, the anti-inflammatory kind of steroids, which helped until they took me off of them, and they came back, and then they gave me a second course. The steroids unmasked a vulnerability to mood disorder. And I had not been bipolar. In fact, president of NBC News once said that Jane Pauley had the best mental health in the business. And of course I totally agreed. I mean, that was my self-image. Normal, Midwestern, level-headed, feet on the ground, reality-based, totally my self-image. But the steroids, the treatment for hives, notoriously are mood destabilizing. Anybody who's on steroids knows that you go up very carefully and you come down very carefully because they rev you up and then they push you down. So that someone on steroids might fall into a depression, which I did, and was treated with antidepressants, first time in my life. I'm on the air all this time. I'm working until about 10 months after the hives were first treated with the antidepressants because of the emergency room. I'm suddenly feeling great. I'm feeling really, really good. And by coincidence, I'm beginning a sabbatical from NBC, which I had negotiated in a contract. And the ridiculous coincidence that on the first Monday of my sabbatical, and feeling really good for the first time in months, and with many plans. I'm writing a book, I'm doing, a magazine thing. I had so many projects. And I'm telling the doctor. And at the end of a session with the doctor, he tells me, says, Jane, do you know what bipolar is? And I said, well, yes, I think that's what they used to call hypomania. And he said, well, you seem to be racing. And he knew what had happened. He knew he was looking at someone, they call it flipping, switching. When someone who was not mentally ill is suddenly mentally ill by virtue of a medical treatment. So the steroids had unmasked a vulnerability to a mood disorder. One would have to look at my family history to know if I had family history. I'm not aware of it, but it must have been there. So my 6-week sabbatical turns into a 6-month leave of absence, during which time I told people I was writing a book, and so the questions really weren't asked. And I was able to recover privately, though I think my friends at NBC were worried about me. I've seen pictures of myself in December before I left, and I looked god awful, but I didn't know how bad I looked. I immediately told Tom Brokaw. I told Neil Shapiro. He was head of news at that time, and I told the executive producer of Dateline. So I wasn't shy about that. I wanted them to know where I was, and I would get better. I came back to work, and I'm about to answer the question you asked, which was, what was the most memorable story I covered for Dateline? Because I returned to work after a 6-month leave of absence, a little wobbly, a little uncertain, on September 10th, 2001. The next day was September 11. And at that point, the whole country was suffering from unrecognized vulnerabilities. And the whole country was scared and depressed. To be a journalist or a first responder was to feel like you had useful work to do. My husband is a cartoonist. He didn't know why. Why am I going back to work? Imagine you're, a sales clerk at Saks, Fifth Avenue. Why am I going to work? What's the point? Yeah. To be a journalist, to cover this story with Tom Brokaw, as our captain, gave me and all of us who worked in news, a reason. And I did a story about the families, one of the families of Flight 93, you remember the Pennsylvania crash and the people who knew what was happening and they had cell phones and they talked to loved ones, some of them for, a half hour or more. They anticipated, what was going on. They understood that terrorists were in charge and they had this heroic effort. What a story. And one of the wife of one of the guys on Flight 93, and her family, we told that story. And I won an Emmy that week. It's hard to say, yay, an Emmy that week, but it was to come back from what I'd been through. Of course, at that time, nobody in NBC knew what I'd been through.
Right.
And didn't. I was writing a book, but I lost interest in the book. Who cared about my life at that point? And it took me about a year and a half to come back to the book, and I put the book out and wrote about being sick. And to this day, that's after being a working mother with children, being an anchor who had a diagnosis of bipolar, and came back. I came back and I had my own television show for a year after that. So it's funny about my career. It's for someone who lives such a private life. The impact that I had that had an impact was the offstage stuff that the lifestyle that I didn't share publicly, having children and then getting sick and coming back from it, are probably the things that were most important about my on-air reputation.
This confluence of events in 2001, you decided to take time off from work anyway. You're thinking about writing. You're maybe not entirely happy with the stories that your show is doing. Then you have this diagnosis, this life-changing diagnosis.
I was 50 years old.
And then this life-changing event. Did that refocus you? Did it re-energize you? Did covering 9/11 in some way give you a purpose again for what you were doing?
Nope. But I know something I read in the paper the other day. The 40s are the worst. The unhappiest decade. And this is true of men and women, rich and poor, around the world. That there are two spikes of well-being, and the 40s are the trough. But at the end of the 40s, in the early 50s, and this is the way humans tend to come, the 50s start getting better. And health being okay, they continue to get better to the point that at the age of 70, a person who is healthy and fit is as happy as a 20-year-old. Which is saying a lot, because the 20s aren't that great either, but a 20-year-old is probably pretty happy. I think it wasn't a coincidence that I got sick in my late 40s, and that my 50s I got better and better, and I'm 60 now. I take care of myself. I mean, once I became bipolar, that's a diagnosis that I have to deal with. But I've not had a recurrence, and I do take care of myself. But I also you get a tailwind, and I think more than anything, I'm a good case for 50s. The 50s are good, and I'm hoping the 60s are good too.
Okay. Your advice to anyone getting into this business now would be?
Keep your eye on the horizon. I remember Sylvester Weaver, the father of Sigourney Weaver, but in his own right, one of the visionaries of television. Sylvester Weaver created the Today Show, And he also created the commercial pod, that made commercial television possible, where you put the ads in the, because before that it was, the
Single sponsor
the Camel News Caravan, Camel cigarettes, would sponsor a whole show. And he spoke at NBC, and I remember thinking, I'm looking at, that's what a visionary looks like. And what must it be like to invent, a medium? Commercial television didn't exist before he and his generation invented it. And as he spoke, television was probably 50 years old. And now journalism, newspapers, my husband's a cartoonist, he's in the newspaper business, television news, there are so many sources for news. My kids get their news from many, many different places, and newspapers and TV are but a wee fraction of it. So anyone going into journalism today is going to be lucky enough to be part of something that you and I don't see. The visionaries that create the new journalism, because there will always be journalists, there will always be people who are just genetically called to find out what happened and to tell, who have the ability to tell stories and comprehend and complex things and make connections and get it first. And that journalists are still being born. It's just that the journalism that I grew up practicing and admiring, the journalists around me, my betters, is in its dying days, and something new is going to be born. So the journalist of the future, young lady, be really smart.